3 black sedans, 6 men in expensive suits, 1 blonde woman clutching grocery bags like a lifeline. The Walmart parking lot at 6 p.m. suddenly felt like a crime scene waiting to happen. Connor Hayes heard the engines cut, heard car doors slam with military precision, watched his 7-year-old daughter's eyes widen through the rear window as the men formed a tight circle around the trembling woman. "Daddy, why are those men wearing sunglasses when it's getting dark?" Zoe's innocent question hung in the evening air. The tallest man stepped forward, hand buried deep in his vest pocket. His smile was winter cold. The woman ran toward Connor's truck, terror painting her face pale. Connor stepped out slowly, placing himself between the strangers and his child. His voice cut through the tension like steel. "Wrong target, wrong day, gentlemen." The man with the hidden hand stopped walking. His laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Who says we got the wrong target?" Connor's calloused fingers found the truck's door handle. The metal was still warm from the sun. "Zoe, get down in your seat. Now." His daughter's Disney backpack rustled as she obeyed without question. The blonde woman reached his truck, her breath coming in short gasps. Mascara had traced dark rivers down her cheeks. Her grocery bag hit the asphalt, sending oranges rolling like miniature suns across the concrete. "Please," she whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. "I can't. They won't." The tallest man was close now, close enough that Connor could see the silver threading through his dark hair, close enough to smell expensive cologne mixed with something else, something that reminded Connor of the machine shop where fear had its own metallic scent. The man's companions spread out like wolves, one to the left, positioning himself near the shopping cart return, another to the right, his hand resting casually on his hip. The third remained by the cars, blocking any exit. Connor had seen this formation before, in places where good men went to die. His pulse steadied, the way it always did when violence became inevitable. "Sir, this doesn't concern you," the tall man said. His voice carried the smooth authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We just need to have a conversation with the lady." Connor glanced at the woman. Her hands shook as she fumbled with her purse strap. The leather was expensive, but the edges were worn. Like someone who had money once but had been running for a long time. "Seems like she doesn't want to talk," Connor replied. The evening breeze carried the scent of cooling asphalt and something else. Ozone, like the air before a storm. The tall man's smile never wavered, but his eyes had gone flat. Empty. "Everyone wants to talk, Mr. Hayes. It's just a matter of finding the right encouragement." The use of his name hit Connor like ice water. He hadn't introduced himself, hadn't given these men any reason to know who he was. The woman beside him made a sound like a wounded animal. "How do you—" Connor started to ask, but the tall man was already turning away. "Friday 6 p.m., the old Morrison warehouse on Elm Street," the man called over his shoulder. "Bring what belongs to us, and we'll forget this little misunderstanding ever happened." The 3 men walked back to their cars, with the unhurried confidence of predators who knew their prey couldn't escape. Engines purred to life, tires whispered against asphalt. In 60 seconds, the parking lot looked normal again. But normal was a lie. Connor could feel it in the way his daughter's breathing had gone shallow, in the way the woman beside him was staring at nothing, her eyes focused on some invisible horror, in the way his own heart was beating just a little too fast. "Lady," he said quietly, "I think you'd better tell me what's going on." She looked up at him then, and Connor saw something he recognized. The same look Rachel had worn in those final weeks, when the cancer had been winning and they both knew it. The look of someone who had run out of places to hide. "My name is Victoria Blackwood," she said, "and I'm supposed to be dead." 2 years earlier, Connor Hayes had been a different man. The kind who came home to the smell of Rachel's cooking and the sound of Zoe's laughter echoing through their small house on Maple Street. The kind who worried about normal things like mortgage payments and whether his daughter was eating enough vegetables. Death had a way of changing a man's priorities. Now, standing in his kitchen at 7:30 p.m., Connor watched Victoria Blackwood cradle a cup of coffee between her hands like it might warm something that had gone cold inside her. She had showered and borrowed one of Rachel's old sweaters. The blue brought out her eyes, but it couldn't hide the exhaustion that seemed to radiate from her bones. "Richard died 18 months ago," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Car accident on Interstate 75. At least, that's what the police report said." She took a sip of coffee and winced, as if even that simple act required more strength than she possessed. "I found the insurance papers 3 weeks after the funeral. $2 million. More money than I'd ever seen." Zoe sat at the kitchen table, carefully coloring inside the lines of a princess dress. Her tongue poked out slightly as she concentrated, the way Rachel's used to when she was focused on something important. Connor poured himself coffee, noting how Victoria's eyes never stopped moving, always checking the windows, the doors, the shadows in the corners. "Insurance money isn't a crime," Connor said. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it, just exhaustion and something that might have been regret. "No, but murder is." The word hung in the kitchen air like smoke. Zoe's crayon paused mid-stroke, though she didn't look up from her coloring book. Children heard everything, Connor had learned. They just pretended not to. Victoria set down her coffee cup with the careful precision of someone trying not to let their hands shake. Richard had enemies, business associates who didn't appreciate his flexible approach to accounting. The accident wasn't an accident. Outside, a car door slammed. Victoria flinched, her entire body going rigid. Connor moved to the window, peering through the curtains. Mrs. Patterson from next door was taking out her garbage, moving with the unhurried gait of an elderly woman going about her evening routine. "You're safe here," Connor said, returning to the table. But even as he said it, he wondered if that was true. Safe was something he'd thought he could promise Rachel, too. "Those men at the store, they think you have something that belonged to your husband." Victoria nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup in endless circles. Richard kept files, names, bank account numbers, details about transactions that shouldn't exist. "I found them after he died." The kitchen light flickered, casting dancing shadows across Victoria's face. In the brief darkness, she looked younger, vulnerable in a way that reminded Connor of the kittens Zoe had wanted to adopt from the shelter. Small things that needed protecting from a world that was far too dangerous for something so fragile. "What kind of transactions?" Connor asked, though part of him already knew he wouldn't like the answer. Victoria's smile was bitter as winter wind. "The kind that clean, dirty money. The kind that make problems disappear. The kind that bought him a $2 million life insurance policy. And a shallow grave on a highway outside Atlanta." Morning came too early, and brought with it the sound of engines idling outside Connor's house. He counted 3 vehicles from his bedroom window: a van, a sedan, and something that might have been a pickup truck, though the tinted windows made it impossible to be certain. Victoria stood beside him, her borrowed nightgown ghostly in the dawn light. "They're not going anywhere, are they?" she asked. Connor shook his head. In the distance, he could hear the garbage truck making its weekly rounds. The sound was comforting in its normalcy. Routine continuing even when the world had gone sideways. "No, I don't think they are." Zoe appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Her hair stuck up in wild directions, defying gravity and every attempt Connor had made over the past 2 years to learn how to braid it properly. "Daddy, why are there cars outside?" Before Connor could answer, his phone rang. The number was blocked, but he answered anyway. Mr. Hayes? The voice was smooth, professional. Not the tall man from the parking lot, but someone who sounded like he might wear expensive suits and have his shoes shined daily. I trust you slept well. Connor felt his jaw clench. Well enough. The man on the phone chuckled, a sound like ice cubes clinking in expensive whiskey. I'm calling about our mutual friend, Ms. Blackwood. Victoria moved closer, pressing her ear near the phone. Her hair smelled like the cheap shampoo from Connor's shower, but underneath that was something else. Something floral and expensive that spoke of a life very different from the one she was living now. What about her? Connor asked. She has something that belongs to my employer. Something very important. The man's voice never changed tone, never betrayed emotion. It was the voice of someone discussing the weather or the price of groceries. We'd very much like it back. Connor glanced at Victoria. Her face had gone pale, but her eyes were steady. Whatever fear she felt, she was keeping it locked away where it couldn't be used against her. And if she doesn't have what you're looking for? Connor asked. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for him to count his own heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. Everyone has something they can't afford to lose, Mr. Hayes. Your daughter goes to Lincoln Elementary. She's in Mrs. Rodriguez's second-grade class. She likes ballet and swimming and has a purple lunchbox with a unicorn on it. The world went very quiet. Connor could hear his own breathing, could feel the blood pounding in his temples. Beside him, Victoria's hand found his arm, her fingers digging into his skin through his t-shirt. You stay away from her, Connor said, his voice dropping to something that barely qualified as human. That's entirely up to you, the man replied. 12 hours, Mr. Hayes. The Morrison warehouse on Elm Street. Come alone and bring what belongs to us. The line went dead. Connor set the phone down with the careful precision of someone trying not to crush something delicate. His hands were shaking, just slightly. Enough that Zoe might notice if she was paying attention. Daddy? Zoe's voice was small, uncertain. The voice she used when thunder was too loud, or when she woke up from bad dreams about the time before, when Mommy was sick and everything hurt. What's wrong? Connor knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. Her face was still soft with sleep, innocent in a way that made his chest ache. Nothing's wrong, Princess, but we're going to play a special game today. He smoothed her wild hair, marveling at how soft it was. Like spun silk, Rachel used to say. We're going to visit Aunt Sarah for a while. Won't that be fun? Sarah Martinez taught at Lincoln Elementary and had been Rachel's best friend since college. More importantly, her husband Mike was a police detective with the Atlanta PD. If anyone could keep Zoe safe, it would be them. Zoe's brow furrowed in the way it did when she was trying to work out an adult problem that didn't quite make sense. Is the pretty lady coming too? She asked, glancing at Victoria. No, sweetheart. The pretty lady and Daddy have some grown-up things to take care of first. Victoria knelt beside Connor, bringing herself down to Zoe's level. You know what, Zoe? I think you're very lucky to have a daddy who loves you so much. Her voice was steady, but Connor could see the tears she was trying not to shed. He's the kind of daddy who would do anything to keep you safe. An hour later, Connor stood in Sarah Martinez's living room, watching his daughter explore the toy box that Sarah kept for visiting children. The morning light streaming through the windows made everything look normal, peaceful, like the kind of place where little girls could color pictures and not worry about men in expensive suits who knew their school schedule. You sure you don't want me to call this in? Mike asked, his detective instincts clearly troubled by what Connor had told him. These sound like serious people, Con. The kind who don't make empty threats. Connor shook his head. They've got eyes on my house. Probably tapped my phone by now. You call it in, they'll know before the first squad car leaves the station. Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of sandwiches and juice boxes. She moved with the efficient grace of someone who had spent years managing classrooms full of energetic 7-year-olds. "Zoe will be fine here," she said, though her eyes were worried. "But Connor, what you're talking about, it sounds incredibly dangerous." Through the living room window, Connor could see a blue sedan parked across the street. It hadn't been there when he'd arrived 20 minutes ago. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, but he could feel the weight of watching eyes. "I know," he said simply, "but they've made it clear that running isn't an option." Victoria sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, like a child waiting to be called to the principal's office. She had changed back into her own clothes, the expensive ones that marked her as belonging to a world Connor had never been part of. But the clothes couldn't hide the tremor in her hands or the way she kept glancing at the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. "Tell me about the files," Connor said, settling into the chair across from her. Victoria's laugh was sharp, bitter. Richard thought he was clever, keeping insurance policies on all his business partners. Names, dates, bank transfers, enough information to destroy a dozen careers and put twice as many people in federal prison. Mike leaned forward, his cop instincts engaged despite himself. "Money laundering?" Victoria nodded. "Among other things, Richard specialized in making inconvenient problems disappear. For the right price, he could turn drug money into legitimate business investments, make witnesses forget what they'd seen, ensure that certain evidence never made it to trial." The blue sedan's engine started, the sound carrying clearly through Sarah's windows. Connor watched it pull away, only to be replaced by a white van 30 seconds later. "How many copies of these files exist?" he asked. Victoria's smile was sad, resigned. "Just one, on a thumb drive that Richard hid in a safety deposit box. I found the key in his desk drawer 3 days after the funeral." "And you took it?" It wasn't a question. Victoria's hands twisted in her lap, fingers working against each other like small animals trapped in a cage. "I was scared. Richard had told me stories about his business associates. What happened to people who crossed them? I thought if I had leverage, something to trade." Her voice trailed off, lost in the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. Connor stood, moving to the window again. The white van hadn't moved, but he could see the outline of at least 2 figures in the front seats. Professional, patient. The kind of people who could wait all day for the right moment to strike. "They won't stop," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Even if you give them what they want, they won't stop. You know too much." "I know." Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. "That's why I've been running. 18 months of cheap motels and stolen identities, and looking over my shoulder every time I hear footsteps behind me." She looked up at Connor, and in her eyes he saw the same exhaustion he'd felt during Rachel's final days. The bone-deep weariness that came from fighting a battle you knew you couldn't win. "There might be another way," Mike said slowly, his detective brain working through possibilities. "Federal witness protection. If those files contain what you say they do, the FBI would be very interested in making a deal." Victoria shook her head before he'd finished speaking. Richard had contacts in law enforcement, people who made sure certain cases never went to trial. How do I know which agents can be trusted? The question hung in the air like smoke. Connor turned away from the window, his mind working through options that all seemed to end in disaster. Outside, he could hear children playing in the park across the street. Their laughter was bright, innocent, a reminder of what was at stake. "Agent Stevens," Sarah said suddenly. "He spoke at our school last month about internet safety. Mike, didn't you say he was with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit?" Mike nodded slowly. "Tom Stevens. Solid reputation, clean record. If anyone could be trusted with this kind of information." He trailed off, looking at Victoria. But it would mean coming forward, going on record, no more running. Victoria closed her eyes, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts. When she opened them again, something had changed. The fear was still there, but underneath it Connor could see something else. Determination. The look of someone who had finally decided to stop being a victim. "All right," she said quietly. "But first I have to get the drive, and that means going to the bank where Richard hid it." Connor felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Which bank?" Victoria's smile was grim. "First National, downtown Atlanta, the same building where Harrison Consulting has their offices." The same building. Of course it was, because nothing about this situation was going to be simple. Connor looked out the window again, noting how the white van had been joined by a dark SUV. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. "Harrison Consulting," he repeated. "Let me guess. That wouldn't be the same Harrison who's been making your life difficult?" Victoria nodded. "Richard's former business partner, the one who's been sending those men to find me." She stood, smoothing her clothes with hands that shook only slightly. "He knows about the safety deposit box. It's only a matter of time before he gets a court order to open it, or finds someone willing to break the law for the right price." The afternoon sun had shifted, sending long shadows across Sarah's living room. In the corner, Zoe was building an elaborate castle out of blocks, her tongue poking out in concentration. She looked so young, so innocent, so utterly unaware that her entire world might be about to change forever. "We go tonight," Connor decided. "After dark, when there's less traffic, less chance of witnesses." Victoria stared at him. "We? Connor, you don't understand what you're getting into. These people don't just make problems disappear, they make people disappear." Connor thought about that for a long moment, watching his daughter stack blocks with the serious concentration that only a 7-year-old could muster. "Maybe," he said finally. "But they made one mistake. They threatened Zoe. And that's something I can't let slide." The Morrison warehouse sat on the edge of Millbrook like a monument to industrial decay. Built in the 1950s to house textile machinery, it had been abandoned for nearly a decade. Broken windows stared blindly across the empty lot, and weeds had pushed through cracks in the loading dock. It was the kind of place where bad things happened to people who asked too many questions. Connor parked his truck 2 blocks away, in the shadow of an abandoned gas station. The evening air carried the scent of rust and old rain. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the empty landscape. Victoria sat beside him, her hands clenched in her lap. She had changed clothes again, trading her expensive outfit for dark jeans and a black sweater that would blend into shadows. "You don't have to do this," she said for the 3rd time in 20 minutes. Connor checked his watch. 8:45 p.m. In 15 minutes, he was supposed to walk into that warehouse alone and hand over a thumb drive that could put a dozen powerful people in federal prison. The same thumb drive that was currently locked in a safety deposit box 15 miles away. "Yes, I do," Connor replied. He had thought about this during the long afternoon at Sarah's house, watching Zoe play and trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. They know who I am. They know where I live, where Zoe goes to school. Running isn't an option. Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a cell phone. Not her regular phone, but a cheap prepaid device she had bought that morning with cash. "I've already sent copies of the files to Agent Stevens. Whatever happens tonight, Harrison won't be able to cover this up." Connor stared at her. "You mean you already had the drive? This whole time?" Victoria's smile was grim. "I've been carrying it for 18 months. Everywhere I went, every cheap hotel and greasy diner and bus station bathroom. Richard hid the original in the bank, but he was paranoid enough to make copies." The revelation hit Connor like a physical blow. All of this, the threats, The surveillance, the fear. It had all been for something Victoria had been carrying in her purse. Then why didn't you say something earlier? Victoria's hands twisted in her lap. Because I wasn't sure I could trust you. I've been running for 18 months, Connor. Trust isn't something I give easily anymore. 9 came and went. Connor sat in his truck, staring at the warehouse and trying to work up the courage to walk through those doors. The building loomed against the darkening sky like something out of a nightmare. No lights in any of the windows, no sign of movement, just empty darkness and the promise of violence. They're not coming, Victoria said quietly. Something's wrong. Connor felt it too. The prickle of wrongness that made the hair on his arm stand up. This felt like a trap, but not the kind he had been expecting. This felt like something else entirely. His phone rang. Unknown number, but he answered anyway. Mr. Hayes? The same smooth voice from that morning, but now there was something different underneath. Strain. Maybe even fear. I'm afraid there's been a change of plans. Connor's grip tightened on the phone. What kind of change? A long pause, filled with the sound of traffic in the background. The man was calling from somewhere public, somewhere busy. It seems Ms. Blackwood has been more resourceful than we anticipated. The FBI raided our offices 3 hours ago. They had warrants. They knew exactly where to look. Victoria grabbed Connor's arm, her eyes wide. She had heard enough to understand what was happening. The files she had sent to Agent Stevens had been more than just insurance. They had been a declaration of war. Where does that leave us? Connor asked. Though he was beginning to suspect, he already knew the answer. You and your daughter are no longer of interest to my employer, the man said. Ms. Blackwood, however, remains a person of significant concern. She has cost us a great deal of money and caused considerable inconvenience. That kind of behavior requires correction. The line went dead. Connor set the phone down, his hands surprisingly steady. Beside him, Victoria was breathing hard, her eyes fixed on something he couldn't see. It's over, she whispered. They're going to kill me, but it's over. Harrison's going to prison. All of them are going to prison. Connor started the truck. Not if I can help it. Victoria looked at him, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. Connor, you don't understand. These people don't forget. They don't forgive. Even if the FBI arrests Harrison, there will be others. There will always be others. The truck's headlights swept across empty streets as Connor drove back toward town. Maybe, he said. But that's a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, we're going to make sure you live to see it. In the distance, sirens wailed. Police cars, FBI vehicles, the sound of a law enforcement operation in full swing, the sound of justice finally catching up to people who thought they were above it. Victoria pressed her face to the window, watching the lights of Millbrook pass by. I never thanked you, she said quietly, for helping me, for risking everything for someone you barely know. Connor thought about that, navigating the familiar streets of his small town, streets where he had lived his entire life, where he had fallen in love and gotten married and buried his wife and raised his daughter. Everyone deserves someone willing to stand up for them, he said finally. Rachel taught me that. Right up until the end, she was worried about other people. The nurses working double shifts, the janitor who had to clean up after her chemotherapy. She said that's what made us human, caring about people we don't have to care about. They drove in silence for a while, listening to the hum of the engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. The radio played soft jazz, the kind of music Rachel had loved during the quiet hours when Zoe was asleep, and they could pretend, just for a little while, that everything was going to be all right. What happens now? Victoria asked as they pulled into Connor's driveway. The surveillance vehicles were gone, replaced by ordinary suburban quiet, porch lights glowing warm against the darkness, the sound of a television drifting from the house next door. Now you disappear, Connor said. New identity, new life. Witness protection, if Agent Stevens can arrange it. Victoria unbuckled her seatbelt but didn't move to get out of the truck. And you? What happens to you and Zoe? Connor looked at his house, small and ordinary and perfect in its simplicity. The kind of place where a man could raise his daughter and maybe, eventually, learn to be happy again. We go back to normal, he said. Whatever that means now. Victoria reached over and took his hand, her fingers small and warm against his calloused palm. Normal is a gift, Connor. Don't ever forget that. Don't ever take it for granted. They sat like that for a long moment, two people who had found each other in the midst of chaos and somehow managed to save each other. Then Victoria opened the truck door and stepped out into the night. Will I see you again? She asked. Connor shook his head. Probably not. And that's for the best. The farther you stay away from here, the safer everyone will be. Victoria nodded, understanding. She walked to the front door, then turned back one last time. Tell Zoe I said goodbye. Tell her that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust someone you barely know. Then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness like she had never been there at all. Connor sat in his truck for a long time after that, listening to the engine tick as it cooled and thinking about the strange turns life could take. Tomorrow he would pick up Zoe from Sarah's house. They would have pancakes for breakfast, and he would braid her hair, badly, and they would talk about normal things like homework and ballet lessons and what they wanted to watch on television. But tonight, he would remember the look in Victoria Blackwood's eyes when she finally stopped running. The moment when a woman who had been a victim for 18 months decided to become a survivor instead. It was the kind of courage that couldn't be taught or bought or faked. The kind that came from having nothing left to lose and everything still worth fighting for. 3 months later, Connor Hayes stood in his kitchen making pancakes for breakfast. Outside, spring was beginning to take hold of Millbrook. The maple trees were budding, and Mrs. Patterson was already working in her garden, preparing for another season of tomatoes and corn and the roses that had won her 3 blue ribbons at the county fair. Zoe sat at the kitchen table, carefully writing her name on a piece of construction paper. Her handwriting had improved dramatically since the beginning of the school year. Now the letters were mostly the right size and pointed in the right direction, though she still struggled with the letter Q for reasons Connor couldn't quite fathom. "Daddy," she said without looking up from her work, "do you think the pretty lady is happy now?" Connor paused in his pancake flipping, spatula suspended over the pan. They hadn't talked about Victoria in weeks, not since the nightmares had finally stopped and Zoe had gone back to sleeping through the night. "I hope so, Princess. I think she's probably in a place where she feels safe." Zoe nodded solemnly, adding a careful flourish to the final E in her name. "Good. I liked her. She smelled like flowers and she wasn't scared of the mean men." Connor smiled, remembering. No, she wasn't scared. Not when it mattered. The pancakes were golden brown, fluffy in the way that Rachel had taught him during those early days of their marriage, when they had been young and broke, and happy in the way that only people who had their whole lives ahead of them could be. He plated them carefully, adding butter and syrup and the strawberries that were Zoe's current obsession. "Will we ever see her again?" Zoe asked, cutting her pancake into precise, triangular pieces. Connor considered the question, watching his daughter's airious face as she contemplated breakfast geometry. "Probably not, sweetheart. Sometimes people come into our lives for just a little while. Like angels, maybe. They help us when we need it, and then they move on to help someone else." Zoe accepted this with the philosophical resignation that 7-year-olds brought to adult explanations that didn't quite make sense. "Like Mommy?" she said matter-of-factly. "She was here for a while, and now she's helping other people in heaven." Connor's throat tightened. the way it always did when Zoe talked about Rachel with such casual acceptance of loss. "Yeah, Princess, like Mommy." The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, warming Connor's face and highlighting the dust motes that danced in the golden light. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of children playing in the park. Life continuing, moving forward, carrying them all toward whatever came next. His phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number, but when he opened it, he found a single photograph. A woman with short, dark hair and different clothes, standing in front of what looked like a community center. Her smile was genuine, unguarded in a way that Victoria Blackwood's had never been. Below the photo was a single line of text. "Thank you for giving me back my life. V." Connor stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. Some gifts were meant to be kept secret, held close to the heart where they could do their quiet work of healing. He pocketed the phone and returned to his breakfast, listening to Zoe chatter about her upcoming ballet recital and the new girl in her class who had just moved to Millbrook from somewhere far away. Outside, the world was waking up to another ordinary day. Mrs. Patterson was watering her tomato seedlings. The mail truck was making its rounds. A jogger passed by, earbuds in, lost in whatever music or podcast was carrying her through her morning routine. It was the kind of normalcy that Connor had once taken for granted, before he learned how precious and fragile it could be. "Daddy?" Zoe's voice brought him back to the present. "I love you." The words were simple, uncomplicated by the weight of everything that had come before or the uncertainty of everything that lay ahead. Connor reached across the table and brushed a strand of hair away from his daughter's face. "I love you too, Princess, more than all the stars in the sky." It was something Rachel used to say, back when their biggest worry was whether Zoe would sleep through the night or eat her vegetables. Now it felt like a promise, a commitment to the future they were building together, one ordinary day at a time. The morning stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities, ballet lessons and grocery shopping, and maybe a trip to the park if the weather held. Simple things, normal things. The kind of life that people like Victoria Blackwood had to fight for, had to risk everything to protect. Connor finished his coffee and began clearing the breakfast dishes, listening to Zoe practice her spelling words under her breath. In a little while, he would drive her to school and go to work at the machine shop and pick her up in the afternoon. They would have dinner and watch cartoons and read stories before bedtime. It would be completely, wonderfully ordinary. And somewhere, in a place he would never know about, a woman who had spent 18 months running from shadows was building a new life. Learning to trust again, to hope again, to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The kitchen filled with the sounds of an ordinary morning, dishes clinking in the sink, Zoe humming a song she had learned in music class, the distant sound of traffic as Millbrook woke up to another day. Connor smiled, watching his daughter finish her breakfast, and thought about second chances, about the courage it took to stand up for someone you barely knew, and the grace that came from letting someone go when holding on would only cause more harm. Outside, the spring sun climbed higher into a blue sky, warming the earth and everything growing in it. Life continuing. Life moving forward. Life exactly as it should be.